So the new Yes album, Mirror to the Sky, has been out for a few days, and I wanted to offer some thoughts, partly about the album itself, but partly also about the state of Yes 50 years after Close to the Edge, and whether or not we really even need to continue adding to the Yes catalog. Now, most people who are going to watch this video will likely know all the context for this, but this is, of course, the first new Yes album since the death of Alan White, and that leaves Steve Howe as the only member who's been in something you could remotely call a classic lineup. I do love drama, but that seems to me to be in a different category than the 70s material. Now, I'm Hans from Electric Brain Electric Shadow. We are a contemporary art rock project that is influenced by prog rock, post-rock, post-punk. Check us out on Bandcamp, your favorite streaming service, or one of the album playlists I have here on the channel. Now, Yes released The Quest in 2021, which got some decent reviews and was generally regarded as better than 2014's Heaven and Earth, which of course seems to be, as far as I can tell, pretty broadly thought of as the nadir of their studio catalog. And the pre-release buzz has been that Mirror to the Sky was going to be another step up from The Quest, and that this lineup of Yes has big plans and is full of ideas and is going to be putting out an album a year for the next 10 years, or something to that effect. A little digression here. I was reading the Wikipedia page for Heaven and Earth because I was curious if it was as poorly regarded as I remembered. A little digression here. I was reading the Wikipedia entry about the album Heaven and Earth because I was curious if it was as poorly regarded as I remembered. And there's a quote here from some asshole critic who seems to have a grudge against basically the whole idea of Yes. And he singles out for ridicule the lyric, getting to know the empty space beneath the surface of the common days. And I have to say, that's a good lyric. It hints at a thoughtful relationship to ennui and depression. It's a little philosophical in a straightforward way, touches on mindfulness and spiritual practice without being preachy. It avoids cliches or stock language. I think it's a really good line, in a way that would be a good line if you stuck it in a totally different context by a different type of artist. And it's funny to me that of all the, frankly, dozens and dozens of lines of Yes lyrics that could legitimately be considered silly or embarrassing, this guy's managed to single out an actual good lyric. But to get back to Mirror to the Sky, how is it? Well, if Heaven and Earth was bad and The Quest was meh, then this is a step above meh, right? But having listened to it on several consecutive days, it still feels more not bad than actively good. Now, a lot of the criticisms of Heaven and Earth in particular came down to it being low energy, which is fair, right? I saw them at a casino in 2015, and it felt like everything was being played at 3/4 of the appropriate speed. And you would feel like a total ageist asshole for putting any blame for that on Alan White, but this album does have a pep that they haven't really had for the last 10 years or so, right? It's not fast, but everything sort of jogs along at mid-tempo or a bit faster. There's not a lot of space that doesn't have a decent amount going on in the arrangement. And there's a sense of caring here that, I didn't necessarily get at all from Heaven and Earth and didn't get as much from The Quest. As far as what this lineup is doing, I really like Billy Sherwood's bass, actually, which I don't know if I'd really realized before how much I appreciate what he's doing. He plays interesting, propulsive bass lines that are complex without being cluttered. The bass is often the most interesting element in the arrangement. He's clearly playing with an awareness of and a debt to Squire's style, but he also does some things that don't feel like obvious Squireisms, particularly some kind of swoopy melodic fills that are quite nice and add a texture that maybe wouldn't be there if Squire were still in the band. His tone doesn't necessarily have the chunk and thickness of Squire's, but, that might be mixing or production as much as it is a quality of him as a player. Now, I'd have been the first person to say that the death of Chris Squire would have been a great time to put an end to any further Yes activity, and obviously he's irreplaceable, but it is surprising to me that the bass playing would be my favorite thing on a new Yes album. Geoff Downes does pretty well. I recently re-listened to Fly From Here, and I was impressed by the depth and the atmosphere of his keyboard work on that album. I don't necessarily have the same sense here, but he contributes quite a range of sounds and textures. At the same time, he does that without ever really dominating the song, and I think that balanced quality is actually a nice thing about the album as a whole. That being said, he doesn't really have, at least here, a really distinct sound or style as a player, right? And that's in some ways admirable, but maybe in other ways something that feels lacking compared to other versions of the band. Steve Howe is kind of hit and miss for me. A lot of the time he's playing long sustained notes in a Steve Howe-ish sort of tone without doing much that feels that expressive or memorable. And, a lot of what he seems to be doing here is just sounding like Steve Howe, right? And thereby adding a bit of legitimacy to the fact that this band is even called Yes. That being said, even though in some places he maybe feels like he's on autopilot, in other places he does contribute some interesting touches when he gets away from his most characteristic style. For instance, there's one song where he uses an auto harp, and that's a really creative and surprising arrangement idea. John Davison is pretty much how he's been on the last couple albums, which is a respectable but less interesting, maybe less colorful version of John Anderson. And that's true of vocal style, but it's maybe just as much true of mood and lyrical theme. The tone of this album leans very much toward bland inspiration, a sort of vaguely spiritual hyper-positivity that is heartfelt but mostly uninspiring and kind of emotionally flat when it's all in that register. We're all made of luminous stardust, that kind of thing, right? Now that's been an aspect of Yes for their whole career, but it's really come to the fore during the Davison era, and it carries over into the melodies as well, which often feel very major key and upbeat, aside from the title track, which gets into a bit moodier territory. Now, it looks like Davison's not the only one writing lyrics, but he's written a decent amount of the lyrics, and, that tone, again, both lyrically, melodically, in terms of the sounds, that tone is very characteristic of his years with the band. In spite of the fact that they are, in fact, named Yes, the classic Yes has a lot of dark images, moody digressions, minor key bits, and I miss that so much on this version of Yes. Now, Anderson had his share of saccharine hippie spirituality, but it was blended with a generous dose of weirdness and idiosyncrasy, and every now and again there'd be a song about explorers freezing to death at the North Pole, right? Here we have the positive spirituality, but we don't have the weirdness. That being said, though, there is something about Davison's kind of presence where he has this sense of humility and this unpretentious quality, and that's an odd thing perhaps to praise in a Yes album. But he makes his points in such a direct way. It does have a charming quality to it. The opening track is about wandering in an international dark sky park and being overcome by the sight of the stars, and he says over and over and over again, International Dark Sky Park. He's not trying to be coy. He's very eager for you to get his idea. And maybe because he's never veiling anything, he does project a sense that he doesn't take himself too seriously. He gives you a sense of niceness that does feel very authentic. That trait makes much of this stuff likable in a way that it might not otherwise be, and probably makes me more disposed to the album than I might otherwise be, even though you may take the thrust of this review as being somewhat negative. Jay Shellen does a good job on drums. He supports the songs, he doesn't grandstand. I don't even know if I could describe his style to you in any compelling way, but, he doesn't necessarily need to come out of the gate and make a name for himself as a player, right? What he's trying to do is support the material, carry out the arrangements, add some of the energy that had maybe been lost. And, like I said about Downes, it really does seem like these guys are all working together as equals, despite the drastically different range of time that they've spent in Yes. And I actually think that's pretty cool. I do admire that. All that being said, there are lots of bits and aspects here that are nice or likable, but the sense I come away with after, a listen a day since Friday is of not doing anything vividly enough to make an impression. The melodies are nice, but they're not memorable in the way of their most catchy stuff. There's some fiddly bits that I couldn't personally play, but there's nothing really strikingly complicated by the standards of the genre. The general tone of mild, cheerful positivity keeps any particular line or statement from really resonating emotionally because there's so little emotional contrast. Most of the songs are on the long side. They have multiple parts and build-ups, but the contrast between those parts in terms of volume or speed or style is minimal for the most part. And, something like the long build-up at the end of Luminosity, in spite of being a long build, it doesn't really feel like it ends somewhere that far from where it started in terms of dynamic or volume. Now, subtlety is an admirable quality, right? But this sits somewhere on the line between subtle and just mild, and it may even stray a couple of spaces down into just mild. I like it more than the other Davison albums. I think it's better than maybe some of the short poppy songs on the second half of Fly From Here, though not nearly as good as the title suite from that album. It's probably better than Open Your Eyes, which in many places I find actively offensive. But I can't think of any other Yes albums that I don't like more, and the amount of liking more, is probably somewhere between significantly more or entirely different universes of liking. Now, from what I've read, it seems like these guys like each other. It seems like they get along. Seems like they had fun making this album and put themselves into it. If so, I'm glad for all that. That doesn't negate the fact that it's ultimately a resolutely nice album that isn't surprising or risky or all that compelling. It makes me feel none of the things that I feel listening to classic Yes. What it does make me feel is the vague sense of ennui that you have when you encounter something which has a superficial resemblance to a great thing, but is not in fact a great thing for reasons which are partly explainable and partly intuitive. So do I want more of this, right? Should we have a pleasant but underwhelming new Yes album and an accompanying tour every year or two for the rest of the 2020s? And more than that, does it matter either way? This is a band, or at least a band name, a band concept, 20% of a band, that released some of the most daring and adventurous and technically accomplished music of the 70s and arguably the whole 20th century, right? And somehow managed to become remarkably popular while doing so. We've now come to a point where the relevant standard is, can they do an unembarrassing job of sounding like themselves? Is that something we should decry, or is that something we should shrug off? I am of two minds. The argument in favor of more Yes, or of not being bothered by more Yes at least, the great work of the 70s is unimpeachable. It's going to be there no matter what. It's not changing. The work they've done afterward is not going to affect the ability of the great stuff, or, the first couple albums with Trevor Rabin, to stand the test of time, right? And if new fans are interested in Yes, they're probably going to go to the classic stuff, right? If we look them up on Spotify, you see the most played songs are either prog-era classics or hits from the early 80s. As an aside here, it really surprised me that Love Will Find a Way is in the top 5. If you want to talk about what's ruining their legacy, that's probably a bigger blow than an okay-ish new album. People have to do something with their lives, and for these people, that thing is making music, right? And making music as Yes is probably the difference between doing the music as a lucrative and reliable career versus barely scraping by like the majority of professional musicians. And I may have been known sometimes to refer to this lineup as Steve Howe and some guys, but that's not totally fair, right? The first time Jeff Downes was in Yes happened before I was personally born. Billy Sherwood's been involved with Yes on and off for 30 years. Ultimately, if you don't like these new albums, then there's really nothing stopping you from ignoring them. And if some people get some pleasure from them, and this lineup helps keep Yes music being played in a live context, then I suppose that can't help but be a net good. The argument against is this, right? Ultimately, everything that somebody does is part of their legacy. And the more bland late career Yes albums there are, the more their overall catalog and presence in the world is going to be tilted toward dross. That's even more true of embarrassing personnel moves like, re-recording an album's worth of vocals to erase the one contribution someone made in his time with the band. But, I guess they're not doing things like that anymore. If you're someone who pays attention to what happens in progressive music, you're going to be repeatedly reminded of the existence of new Yes. Ultimately, for me, the way that I think of Yes day to day is going to shift when many of the reminders I have of their existence involve kind of underwhelming new albums. It makes me think a little bit about Hawkwind, right? Who, once a year I see have released a new album that's being touted as a return to form, just like the last, 15 years worth of albums were touted as returns to form. Everybody says some kind of halfway nice things about it, and then probably, doesn't ever listen to it again until the next album comes out that's also a return to form, right? At some point as a fan, that does become a little bit exhausting, even if I stopped participating in that cycle with Hawkwind several albums ago. I mentioned earlier in this review that I saw Yes play with Toto in a casino in 2015, and it was really a depressing show. And the longer Yes was on the stage, the more of the crowd left. I dislike Toto personally, but the level of charisma that Toto had, the engagement it generated versus the way that Yes came off, is inevitably, something that made me kind of sad and is part of how I think of Yes now. Maybe the lineup as they are now would be more encouraging, more enjoyable. Maybe I should give them another chance if they come around. But the incredible gulf between the idea of what Yes represented in their prime versus what I was experiencing then did kind of leave a bit of a permanent etch in, the associations that come to me when I think of the band. And, it's reasonable to expect that somebody respect the value of their name. One of the smartest things that Genesis did really ever was knock it on the head after calling all stations, I think. And only a couple of... One of the smartest things Genesis ever did was knock it on the head after calling all stations, only do a couple of intermittent reunion tours. More bands from that era might be wise to pay attention to that example. On the other hand, I guess at this point, with Yes and Hawkwind both of those bands have been existing in a late career twilight for something like 30 or 40 years. So, a few more albums, a few more tours, maybe don't make any real difference in that regard. So of the two arguments that I just made, I think one of those, the first one, the argument for continuing to do what they do, is probably more logically supported. It's probably more reasonable. The argument against was coming from a bit more heartfelt place. I suppose some people may wholeheartedly love this album, and if you do, then that negates a lot of what I've said, right? And there's no aspect of Mirror to the Sky that's so self-evidently poorly considered that I can't imagine the possibility that somebody might happen to react to it quite well in a way that I haven't personally. And like I said before, I might have caught them on a bad night a few years ago, and it might be that the shows they're doing now with this lineup are powerful in a way that was not. But thanks for listening to my thoughts, and I hope you have a good week.